Adam, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Milovan, obviously for setting up the session, and thank you to everyone for coming along today. Please do, per the chat, feel free to eat your lunch and tune in where you can. I will probably speak, as Milovan said, for about 20 or 25 minutes or so in terms of a presentation. And then there's a couple of areas as we'll sort of move through where there'll be some pretty open call-outs for your thoughts and things as well. So I'm certainly open to any questions that you've got or clarifications about the work and what we've done so far. And important to realise as well, this is a relatively is an ongoing process for us. Obviously, 1 year into a major project, there's another social connection project which is in its early months and will run for another 2 to 3 years as well. So we're sort of in the early stages of what will be a long journey, hopefully, in advancing and utilising the measurement here. So I will present today on behalf of Deanne and also Jamie, who's on the call. I'm based in the Swinburne School of Business Law and Entrepreneurship. My main research area is around sport and leisure services. So I lead our sport innovation research group. Deanne's background much more in the psychology space, and Jamie is a PhD student who's 1 year into a journey of working very closely with social connection measurement, and a lot of the things which we'll talk about in advance today are also directly related to her project, and she's done a fantastic amount of work to prepare the material that you'll see today and the ongoing work as well. I did wanted to acknowledge those 3 Australian Research Council grants which are listed there. The first of those is completing at the end of 2023, and the other 2 which you may be familiar with, particularly the middle one around addressing social isolation in Australia, and a third ARC Linkage grant there, which I'll talk to as part of the presentation as well. I will also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we are gathered on today for us here in Melbourne and the Swinburne campus, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So in terms of today's session, as I said, we'll sort of touch on a number of different projects. There's a bit of an overlapping space and cohesion between a number of the different projects we're doing, both in large-scale Australian Research Council grant, but also in a lot of other work that we're doing with our partners, and that extends to sort of local government partners, sport and leisure partners. We're doing some work in esports as well as another area which we're looking at sort of social connection and related outcomes as well. So obviously the concept of measurement is the focus of today, and we'll largely focus when we get to the results on one particular study, just to try and keep that consistent in terms of what we're presenting and what we're advancing there. But certainly this is something which is central and quite central to a lot of the projects which we're undertaking across this team. Broadly speaking, the goals of that team are to conceptualise social connection as a multifaceted construct, to understand the different forms of connection, the different things that add to social connection, and then most critically develop measures which can be used for a range of stakeholders and at a range of different levels to advance an understanding of those levels of connection at those different areas. Central to our thinking, and I'll show one slide which shows you sort of our ultimate goal of this line of work or body of work, is to develop some really robust, very well tested, short, medium and long form measures that can be deployed in a range of different settings, from obviously the longer form, maybe for all the academic style studies, but certainly the short and medium form, which can be deployed at different levels of industry study, where we can't perhaps have 30 or 40 items. It's not realistic to do that in a lot of industry facing work. So the ability to have perhaps 5 or 6 or up to 12 or 14 items, which can provide organisations with a way to collect that sort of information around the level of people's connections consistently. So the session itself, I'll talk firstly just quite briefly through a number of the frameworks. A lot of you, I'm sure, and I can see from your organisations, are familiar with some of the ongoing work that we're doing there, and perhaps some of the reports that these are drawn from. But just wanted to, I guess, introduce some of the frameworks that exist around social connection. We'll talk through a process we're using in terms of the process to develop and pilot and advance a measurement tool. And then I wanted to present some analysis and results from a recent study. It's a study of a group of 611 people, which are representative of the Victorian population. And I think that's a good setting just to work through some of the initial findings and the way that some of the measurement is may be used or may be applicable. We will talk a little bit about our next steps. We do have quite a firm plan on what we'll do over the next 6 months with the measurement and some additional data collections. There's certainly some areas there, particularly around things like the outcomes of social connection and some of the ways that you might use this within organisations. We'd be really keen to hear any advances or thoughts on that. Just to touch, I guess, on just some of the project work. This is drawn from the two major Australian Research Council grants that this group works specifically on the measurement, but often the measurement is just one component of those projects. The one on the left-hand side is activating social connection to address isolation in Australia, partnered by Red Cross, NIMI National, a number of governing bodies, and Today Design. And then on the right-hand side, looking at the social impact and social connection outcomes of community sport clubs, and that's partnered with a couple of different government bodies, but primarily 7 national sport organisations or governing bodies ranging from large and small clubs. Centralisation of that project is in Victoria and Australia and South Australia, but does have a national focus as well. Both large-scale 3-year projects with research fellows and PhD students attached to them, so a significant opportunity to advance and do some very robust work with those. In addition to that, I'll draw on just a couple of insights from a range of other projects which we sort of work on and across as well. Some of those, as you can see, there are specific to things like the aquatic or recreation industry. Likewise, in the bottom left-hand corner is a report called Infrastructure for Social Connection, which was conducted in 2020 and 2021 with the Metropolitan Partnership and a range of local government bodies as well, looking at the sites of social connection and some of the thoughts of practitioners in the space as well. So we will draw on sort of a large setting of background, but just to give you an idea of where some of this work intersects with. So social connection itself as a starting point, critical both at the individual but also the community level is I think the point we want to make here. So we know, and I'm sure a number of you will have connections and rationales as to why social connection may be important, either as a standalone measure or as something alongside other really important constructs as well. But ultimately, those social relationships and connections are really important to individual well-being. So at the individual level or individual measurement, they have obviously some critical relevance. Likewise, at a community level, there's lots of evidence to suggest that social connection, among other things, does help generate a range of social values or social capital outcomes. So these may be trust, levels of social cooperation, aspects of resilience, and other forms of social capital may also form there as well. But ultimately, at its core, our key takeaway here from a starting point is social connection, both at an individual level, but also at a community setting, can have and deliver great benefits. Those benefits are seen to be wide-ranging, so an integral aspect of both community and individual level. Those with fewer connections are likely to report a wider range of adverse physical and psychological health outcomes. Often we find social connection work is rooted or attached to a particular context. That may be things like mental health, it may be high school students or youth communities, it may be the impact on participants in a particular activity. And that's important because we did go through whether there's a number of people on the call here who were engaged in this process, but looking at the full range of past work, sort of a year or so ago, took capture of all of the social connection and related studies that existed. And often they were very context specific, so looking at a particular cohort or a particular group. We read more and more, I think it's fair to say, in social connection in the media and in different forms as well. So in the last week or so, the World Health Organization has launched a commission to look and explore social connection. They put together a panel of experts who will meet for the next couple of years, but obviously putting a central focus on that idea of connection. Likewise, whether again it's aspects of men's health or youth health, we see more and more talk and discussion about the role of social connection. So obviously something that's central to the operations and the roles of government and policy and a whole range of stakeholders. Critical to the work that we do and what we'll advance today is thinking about social connection as a strengths-based approach. So really thinking about the opportunity that connection can provide, some of the outcomes that it can provide in terms of that. And it's sort of in terms of the rationale for that, really encouraging individuals to be mindful of the resources, understand that there are practical mechanisms that can advance on connection and the outcomes of connection. So we'll largely talk in a couple of different levels around the strength-based approach that we use in a lot of our concepts and work. In terms of some of the frameworks that, again, sort of guide the thinking on the left-hand side, you may be familiar with the Social Connection 101 document advanced by Jane Farmer, and that talks a bit about the process of connection and the social connection circles. So we take from that there are various inputs, there are various outputs, lots of interactions within that space. Within the social connection circles, we find there are different levels of connection, that those circles of connection may give us different things in terms of perhaps the functional or the social or other forms of relationship outcomes that may eventuate from those interactions, but obviously different types of connections that we can understand and a structured process for that. On the top right-hand side is a nice conceptualization from the 10 to Men work, which is an ongoing study funded by or partly by the Australian government, and talks about a couple of different components there, which may lead to our sense of social connectedness. And you'll see quite a bit of overlap with the constructs which we'll advance and talk about today. And this particular structure, talking about the community integration, so the level of involvement perhaps in community individual interactions, or in community groups or activities or processes which are run by communities. Likewise, the relationships that people have and their attitudes towards those relationships, and also critically the perceived level of social support that they have, or the social support services and resources that are available via the things that they do. So essentially they're the level of integration, their perspective of relationships, and their perspective of social support lead us to this concept of social connectedness. In the bottom right-hand side, it's a little bit different, but it really talks about, I guess, the infrastructure for social connection. It's probably related a little more to particularly one of the ARCs, but really just understanding there that if we think about a basic, 4Ps model of places and people, and practices and policies, or we look at sort of the connectors and the people, the activities, the spaces and places, which can be, of course, physical, virtual, or hybrid, and I guess the foundation of those activities that are taking place as well. But we can sort of start to map the infrastructure and the sorts of things and people and policies that can have a positive role on these outcomes. So again, that document specifically speaks to that. In terms of then where we arrive at, I guess, a starting point and a conceptual framework for sort of what we'll talk about today, drawing on, I guess, some of those more practical frameworks which we've sort of shown on the last couple of slides, some of the very structured and robust work which is done by sort of other academic authors, and indeed some of those industry reports on the prior page as well. But we sort of arrive at this as our starting point, which brings together, I guess, some of the emergent structures, and at this stage, more the conceptual thinking around the different components of connection. So when we're thinking about how connection happens, how it forms, how it can be measured, sort of 4 different areas that we could apply our thinking and measurement to. So on the left-hand side is structural, which really talks about what we can observe as a network. It's, to be honest, it's more of an objective form of really identifying the number of people, the level of interaction that we have within our networks, the variety and the complexity across those networks, and how frequently we have interaction. So when we're asking people about that structural component, for us, it's thinking more about, I guess, and not to reduce this in its sophistication, but much more of a counting or objective exercise where we might ask the number of people that someone's connected with, how frequently they see them, and those sorts of aspects. We can, of course, advance that to get people's perspectives or their level of satisfaction with the level of connections they have. And you'll see us and sort of see some questions aligned with that in some of our work as well. That structural component really about the network or interactions people have. The functional component we'll talk through in a bit more detail a little later, but it's really about that level of social support. So what sort of purposeful or value do people get from their relationships that they have, and the extent to which those relationships serve those various social support and social needs. From the affective point of view, we're looking really there at the perceptions of a sense of connection or a sense of belonging. This has been quite central to the way that social connectedness or social connection has appeared in past measurement forms dating back to the 1990s and 2000s and since. And then on the right-hand side is really a sense of quality. So in this sense, we're looking at sort of the perceptions of the positive or negative aspects of the relationships that we have. So across the range of relationships, are they positive or negative? What's leading to those sorts of things, and what sort of value do we get from those different interactions? So we can think about this at its core as 4 quite distinct ways to think about or measure connection. And what we're interested here is understanding really is this a multifaceted or a multi-dimensional component? To what extent do each of these different forms of measurement or opportunities to measure add value to our understanding and measurement of connection overall? Now, not to give too much away with the results that we'll show, but we will largely focus today on the functional and the effective. We do sort of see, and we've got some quite robust evidence already, that they are the main drivers of sort of things or outcomes like well-being. The quality component is one that we do have a little bit more work in field at the moment, so we'd expect that to be a more prominent part of some future discussions. The structural is one that we've always thought is quite interesting, but probably hasn't got the direct impact or the direct force on well-being as some of those other areas do, and I'll show you some results of that in a moment. So using that as sort of our conceptual base, I'll talk a little bit about the measurement and the work that we've done here. A couple of notes on measurement generally first to set the scene, that it is quite a complex space. There are over 40 to 50 papers at least that we can identify that talk about connection or related components. We have as a team had the pleasure of collating and going through in detail each of those. That exercise has included isolating each of the more than 500 individual items that have been used to measure an aspect of connection. That may be something quite broad like belonging, or things very, very specific within some of those sort of 4 boxes that I showed you a moment before. Obviously, there is significant overlap between those 500, so we have been able to bring together common measurement areas and really try and distill that down to get the maximum coverage we can from past work, but also keeping a level of relevance. And that level of relevance has been assisted by the work of other academics, but also industry partners, including a number of those that I can see on the call today who've been in various workshops and panels with us to help refine either the wording or the thinking around how certain aspects may add value. Our measurement, again, is sort of focused more at the population level, we should say as well. So that's our starting point here, is to develop some measurement that can be used either for a population or a sample of people. Much of the work that we've done so far has been in a geographic area, and we'll probably continue to do that for a number of the next studies as well, but really looking for representative, either state-based or regional-based populations that we can sort of explore age and gender and income and the impacts of some of those things as well. Certainly our thinking is then to transition that and to allow that to inform measurement that can be used at smaller program levels. So if we give the example of perhaps a dozen or 20 people are going through an 8-week program, we are certainly conscious of having the measurement eventually have maybe a set of 5 or 6 core items that can be asked at the start, middle, and end of a program like that to advise how connection may change without obviously going through the medium or longer form measures there. Some of the limitations of past work, just to touch on those as well, is that connection is often conceptualized through a lack of connection, or more commonly negatively framed items that are said to measure connection. So if you look at the original social connectedness scale, it is ultimately perhaps completely negatively worded. It's something that we've had a number of industry partners express some, I guess, confusion, discomfort, various levels of those terms to say, hey, we're looking at measuring connection here, but all we can find, or the initial or major items that have been used, have largely been negatively worded in a sense. So again, with a strength-based approach, we are looking at leaning more towards the items that sort of conceptualize in a more positive worded setting. There is considerable inconsistency, both in definitions and in the number of concepts which are advanced. So if we just flick back 2, you'll remember we presented sort of 4. There are certainly versions where 1 or 3 can be quite common. But having said that, there's probably still a lack of empirical work. So real data, collection and analysis to inform what is the right structure. So lots of conceptual thinking around these different areas, but really now at the stage where advancing measurement and using empirical studies to validate that conceptual work is our next step. And obviously a standardized approach can have significant benefits as well, we should say. So obviously creating a measure that can be used very widely could have quite positive impacts in terms of its ability to have a benchmark or expected number, to look at consistent patterns and establish what we would expect to see for those who are using the measure as well. I've just got the note of those limitations going to industry impact. We have obviously had a number of different discussions, and this has been on a range of different organisations, from councils and individual organisations, and even people thinking about employee wellbeing and employee connection and social connection within an employee or volunteer basis as well. And a lot of these aspects have caused similar confusion within industry as well. So, is it negatively worded or positively worded items? We've got lots of different options. Which one should we use? And which one can be comfortable that we are going to be able to compare. So again, these limitations that we've confronted, to be honest, quite quickly in any exploration of this at an academic level, are certainly mirrored by some of the discussions, or many of the discussions, that we have within industry as well. So let me summarise that. There are lots of existing measures. We are not starting from scratch and starting from sort of creating wording. It is possible certainly to adapt and use what's gone before. As we said, many are context specific, so they're worded specifically for a high school or perhaps a particular program that they were used to evaluate. And many of these scales are unfortunately very lengthy. So we could lean very quickly towards a 40 or 50 item measure that's been used in the past. I'd argue that's not practical for a lot of the uses of the people on the call, or indeed us who want to obviously measure connection, but also other things like outcomes and antecedents, or things that might lead to that. Of course, the question of, are they strength-based? I'll just give some examples here. The social connectedness scale, its initial wording was around disconnected and feeling distant from people. So a lot of negatively worded items there, which, yes, certainly has some value, but part of the work that we'll do, which you'll see, is comparing strength-based and with sort of these more negatively worded items, and sort of having a look at the comparison of what they offer from an analysis point of view. And obviously the concept of loneliness, which positively is sort of received by and used by a lot of organisations. The way that it's measured is clear in terms of a 4-item capture, which is publicly available, easy to find, and quite easy to deploy. However, we'd argue that the relationship, or the thinking of loneliness versus social connection, are two quite distinct things in terms of their use and concepts. So we know we can also measure a range of different things. So they may be sort of more the attitudinal items of a 1 to 5, 1 to 6, or 1 to 7 scale. I strongly agree or disagree. And that's largely the format which we've used in what I'll show today in terms of that sort of measurement that we've used. However, we can measure a range of different things. So they can be things like the structure of a social network. So you may have seen social network analysis, which relies on ties and an underlying analysis about the strength of those ties and the interactions between those ties. Community integration and activities. So we know there are industry partners which look at sort of some of the behaviours to judge people's levels of connection, or perhaps antecedents to connection. We can look at people's feelings, so their reflections or their satisfaction with social support, belongingness, etc., or the sense of connection that they feel. And likewise, there's a range of outcomes which we need to be quite clear on in terms of the measurement space as well. So whilst largely we're going to rely on survey measures, and we'll present those for the rest of the presentation, there are some options around some diagrammatic measurements. So looking at perhaps overlapping circles. I'll give you one example of that in a moment as well. We can look at more the observation. So then we can ask people a bit more some questions about who and how many people they interact with, how frequently, etc. We can use network data, but as I said, it's largely going to be the scales and items which we'll present in the work today. Our process as a team, just to run over this, obviously we've said there's a number of different sort of overlapping and complementary projects here, and lots of partners who are ultimately wanting to look at similar outcomes from these as well. Essentially, firstly, we're looking to develop that conceptual setting. So those 4 areas of structural, functional, effective, and quality is 4 areas of connection. The item generation process, as I alluded to earlier, did include over 500 items from over 40 studies. They've been reduced and refined, and a lot of work has gone into those, including the work of industry and academic panel experts to refine either the wording or the concept and how we might expect those to load together. We have deployed these items in probably 4 or 5 different studies. I'll talk mainly about one of those studies today, but there's been a range of different pilot studies, each with really quite a different aim and quite a different setting. And sorry, I should say the pilot studies are main studies, about 4 or 5 in total where we've used those items. We have then gone through another round of item refinement, and there's some additional studies which will take place. Some are in field as we speak now, and also in the next month or so, as well as some plans for early next year. And central to this is the translation towards both industry and academic outcomes or outlets as well. So we do envisage a guide and a manual for using this form of social connection measurement. We are very close to a version 1 in terms of the wording and things like that. And I'll sort of give you the general areas of where those items sit as part of the presentation today as well. But we certainly expect ongoing refinement into probably the middle of next year, when we're probably at a version 2, version 3. We're able to provide benchmarks of what we might expect for a functional, effective, and overall type score, and also advancing where possible some single item measures. And again, I'll give you a quick look at that in a moment as well. So we've talked a bit about those components of wellbeing, so structural, functional, effective, and quality. There's some indicators there or some ideas there about the sorts of things which we may collect in each case. And again, just to touch on in terms of our planned outcome, we've mentioned sort of things like a single item or a short form measure for connection. Each of those dimensions, structural, functional, quality, and effective, in an ideal world for a short measure could be measured by 1, perhaps 2 items, but ideally there, if we could have 1 item for structural, functional, quality, and effective, that would be fantastic as a short form measure. We think we are quite close, particularly on a couple of components in that medium measure. So today I can sort of let you know we've got a 16 item 3 construct measurement, which looks to be behaving really well and having some great predictive ability for well-being and the like. And then the longer form measure is something which will continue to advance moving forward. So this obviously gives, as we move through, we'd expect the medium and longer form measures to be better at predicting, to be more robust in its ability to capture variance and things like that. But certainly if we can create single and short item measures that are, I'll be upfront here, 80% as good, that would be quite good still. Obviously the pragmatic or the nature of being able to deploy 4 items in a survey that you're already running, or 4 items in a pre and post perhaps program survey or evaluation tool, is far preferable to the longer forms, which we'll talk about today as well. But in short, we're confident we can get to a really robust measure for each of these. As I said, probably the longer form and the short item, we will need multiple studies in early next year to confirm that. So the Victorian study, which I'll talk through the results a little bit here to close and give some context to, we collected items largely for structural, functional, and effective. They were largely adapted or converted from a number of past studies there. We also included a number of existing scales, so things like the original social connectedness scale of Lee and Robbins, which I think if you Google social connection measurement will be the first thing that pops up for you. We did use the social support or functional equivalent scale from the 10 to Men study, which has been running for a number of years as well, and we did include loneliness as a construct in our work as well. The major outcomes which we relied on here are wellbeing and satisfaction with life. So the Australian Wellbeing Index is a 7-item measure. Satisfaction with life is an established 4-item measure, were our main outcomes. Certainly very open to hearing any feedback about other outcomes which you may suggest would be good ones to consider, particularly once we look at the nuance between what effective, functional, and structural may offer as outcomes. Very briefly, the analysis process, happy to talk through this in more detail after the presentation or offline, but included an exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis process, a measurement model to make sure that our loading of items was robust and strong and clear, and then a structural model which allowed us to test those relationships between what you see on the left and things like wellbeing outcomes. So the social connection measurement that we sort of landed on at the end of that measurement or CFA confirmatory factor analysis stage looked like this, where we had 2 or 3 items for structural, 6 items for functional, and 8 items for effective. There's an indication of the core wording for each of those there. We are still transitioning and trialing a couple of different patterns, combinations, and wording forms in ongoing work. But once that's ready to be deployed, happy to talk to partners about use of the full accurate wording of those, really to make sure we've got one consistent version that's being deployed by whoever's interested in using and working with these tools. So let me jump into sort of some of the results just to let you know how these sorts of forms of connection are explaining the things that we expect them to, and how they're helping us understand some of the perhaps cross-group differences. A couple of different levels of analysis here. The first is just a regression analysis where we're looking at the ability of that structural, functional, and affective components of connection to explain well-being. The strength of those numbers on top of each arrows is essentially the strength of the relationship. So which one is most effective or strongest in predicting those outcomes. And as you can see there at the bottom there, this is really the level of variance explained. So how good a job are these connection dimensions doing in explaining well-being as an outcome? So two key takeaways here is that each of those, structural, functional, and effective, are significant predictors of well-being outcomes. They help us explain in this setting 40 or 50% of well-being outcomes, which is quite strong at this stage. I should say we are controlling here for age and income and gender, which I'll talk about again in a moment, but certainly age and income we know have a strong impact on wellbeing to start with. So we are controlling for those in the analysis. And this is telling us as well that effective, then functional, and then structural have the strongest role to play in terms of that. So if we're looking at really driving positive wellbeing outcomes, it's the effective, driving that effectiveness form of connection, which will have the strongest statistical relationship, then functional, and then structural. These are largely replicated when we do this in another form of analysis, which is called structural equation modeling. Happy to talk through that again in a bit more detail, but you'll see here largely the same sorts of relationships. Effectiveness has the strongest relationship, and we're explaining a good level of variance in terms of these constructs overall. Now, the design of this study, as I said, did allow us to compare the measures that we had preferred and developed and used on the left-hand side with some of those that already existed or related measures as well. So that included the MOS is from the 10 to Men study around social support. Now, I will say at this stage that what we term the functional and the MOS are correlated at about 80% or 0.8. So they are quite similar in terms of the scores that people might give across the two. We used the social connectedness scale from Lee and Robbins as well. That has about a 50% correlation or 0.5 with our effective measure on the left-hand side. So they are a bit more varied in terms of the way that people respond to each of those. And then loneliness we included as well. Just the short outcome here in terms of what we found is that the functional and effectiveness by some distance provided the most effective way or the effective prediction of well-being as an outcome. So if we use functional and effective, it's the best combination of all of those. Even where we add in things like loneliness or substitute those other ones in, our level of variance is really no better. So, and I should say by some distance, those results are quite clear that the effective and the functional measure on the left-hand side are by some distance the best way to predict well-being and satisfaction of all of those individual or combinations of things on that slide there. So again, that gave us some good confidence that the way we were measuring these items was giving us a really strong and robust outcome in a relationship, I should say, that we would expect to see here. Just to give you an idea on how these might change a little bit over time, there was no relationship with gender. However, you can see with income, the majority of those, both in terms of the well-being outcomes in grey, the functional in red, and whilst not completely linear, the effective in black do increase as people's income increases. That's our justification to say, hey, we need to make sure we're controlling for that in any analysis here and in the future. And likewise, whilst we see a sort of a bit of a dip through the 40s, we do generally see overall a statistical relationship between age and some of these measures here as well. So again, important to recognise that we are seeing some patterns that we expect there and that they're important to control for going forward. The last one I'll show you here is again, just back into the sport and leisure context here a little bit and sort of my personal work a little bit more so, but just showing how these sorts of outcomes might be used to describe how groups may differ. So essentially what you're looking at here is the range of different measures across the bottom. In the light grey column is where people do no form of physical activity. So they're not engaged in gyms or informal forms of activity. In the middle column is where they're using informal recreation. So they might be, walking or exercising in informal groups. They're attending gyms or leisure centres and undertaking that form of activity. And then the red is organised sport and lending on a pretty robust form of or quite a bit of past research here, we would expect to see essentially what we're seeing in the majority of patterns there, where as people are engaged more and doing more and spending more time, we would expect their levels of satisfaction with life, well-being, and also some forms of social connection to increase. We've seen that in work for a number of different years in our work, as well as already published studies. We're seeing that both the affective and the structural do generally fit that pattern. Affective, or the sense of belonging or connection, does increase with each step. Functional is pretty similar once people are doing things, so they feel that social support can build equally from informal as well as formal activities. And then we see, as we'd largely expect, well-being to increase quite dramatically at each step of doing more and then more structured activities. We don't find that these other measures, again, the social support MOS point of view, despite it being quite heavily correlated with functional, we don't find those step changes to be as pronounced. Social connectedness has quite a random, to be honest, relationship as those activity levels increase. And likewise, loneliness, we see no significant patterns of increase, or in the sense of loneliness, it's decreased as we move through those stages. So again, the measure here is telling us, or indicating, that I'm largely performing as we would expect and in line with past research as well. So in terms of a summary of sort of what we know, and again, happy to work through or discuss any of those analysis or findings in more detail. But at this form, we have a 16 item, what we'll call the medium form of social connection, which is statistically robust at sort of the construct level, particularly the affective and functional level. It is effective and deployable at population level. It's not difficult to deploy. It's not overly lengthy, and we're using it quite well with a number of different partners. It does have very strong predictive power for wellbeing outcomes. And again, I'll make the point that ability to explain wellbeing as an outcome is greater than some of the other past scales which we replicated here. It does suggest that affective and functional components are the core components of outcomes. So previously, social connection has been measured as a single dimension. This does give support that different components of connection need to be thought about, measured, and perhaps catered for or operationalized by strategies of organizations differently. The items and the constructs that we've used have allowed to identification of cross-group differences, and again does point to or provide some justification to think about the nuance within those different components of connection, that affective and functional are very different in terms of their concepts, and they do behave or explain in different ways as well. So finally, they're just landing on, again, just summarizing where we are at so far. So in terms of a measure for structural, about 2 to 3 items. For functional, it is currently 5, but I think we can probably get down, sorry, it is currently 6. We can probably get down to about 5 items there. And likewise with effective, we're sort of comfortable with 8 items at the moment, but probably thinking that there is an ability to reduce that slightly as well. So at the moment, it's 16 across those 3. We think probably 12 or 13 is realistic. And then we'll add in there, as I said a little earlier, this quality component here, this 4th component, the one listed 3rd down, is something that we've got a range of ongoing work, which is in field or upcoming, which will help us refine that and understand the role of that as well. So in terms of I guess, to prompt some questions or discussions, if you have it, or if you have any thoughts here or wish to share them sort of offline as well, is really thinking about other outcomes. Obviously, wellbeing is quite an obvious outcome that we would expect to see as a relationship, but are there other aspects of social capital, of resilience, of trust, of community pride, or aspects like that, which may either play a role in explaining the relationship with wellbeing, or indeed maybe direct outcomes that may be relevant to your work or understanding. And likewise, the practical translation as well. So obviously the wording is part of that, but obviously the length of the scale is a medium scale to be maybe landing at somewhere between 12 and 16 or 12 and 18 items is probably what we're thinking is going to be a good, robust scale to advance here. I did want to leave you with one additional thing as well, and this is just around, and I've put this in red, in capitals, and in bold, so I do want to be really clear that these are some initial findings from a couple of the data collections where we've been able to put in some sample single items for each of those areas. So what I showed you here is sort of the medium measure, maybe it lands at 12 to 15 items. But we've also sort of experimented with a couple of single items as well. Now, we wouldn't expect this to be as robust or explain as well as the medium form, and in turn, the longer form should probably explain better as well. But positively here, it's about 80% as good as the medium form measure, okay? So it's not explaining the 40 and 50% of wellbeing, but the 35 to 40% of wellbeing outcomes can generally be explained by a combination of these single items. I've just listed a few in them, so they are quite general in nature. We don't feel the wording is perfect, and we're refining that ongoing a little bit as well. We've also experimented, you can see down the bottom, with a single item, which is deployed as a visual component and overlapping circles. So to what extent are you connected with others? They're non-overlapping circles all the way to almost completely overlapping circles. So again, the trial continues with those. I've been very clear here that they are initial findings, but the early results there are quite positive that single items will be quite effective as predictors, or at least worth continuing to look at in the research. So ongoing, we do have a number of panel and project collections which are planned for the next 6 months or so. There will be a release of a measurement translation document. Probably we're one data collection away from being able to release sort of a version of that, and work with some partners if they're interested in perhaps deploying or testing some of those measures as well. We'd expect that to be either before or after the end of the year, so somewhere in the next couple of months. Embedding that measurement, we have a number of major state and national panel collections planned, both within existing work, but if you're interested in sort of deploying the measures or using them alongside what you're doing in other collections, happy to talk about those as well. We do hope to develop, once the scale is final, develop benchmarks for each of those. So obviously things like age and gender are really important to understand. We did have some results around people who identified as a disability or as various other components of the community, where we did see some initial changes. We'll need some larger scale surveys to really validate some of those results as well. But certainly this will be an ongoing process to develop, translate, publish, and continue to share this work. So I will thank you very much for your time. Happy to take any questions or comments that we've got. Milovan, I might turn it back to you.